On the morning of the 3rd of January, 1944, the highest-scoring fighter ace in the United States Marine Corps led a great sweep of American fighters over the most dangerous piece of sky in the Pacific, the enormous Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. His name was Major Gregory Boyington, though the whole Marine Corps knew him as Pappy, and the squadron he commanded had a name that was already becoming legend, the Black Sheep. That morning, in the swirling, tangled dogfight over Rabaul, Pappy Boyington shot down his 26th enemy aircraft, tying the highest score any American had ever reached. And then, in the middle of that same fight, in the space of a few violent seconds, he was simply gone. His plane went down, his wingman was killed. And not one of the dozens of American pilots twisting through that sky saw what happened to Pappy Boyington. To understand the shock of that disappearance, you have to understand what Boyington was by January of 1944. He was not just a good pilot, he was the deadliest fighter pilot the Marine Corps had, a national figure whose kill count was reported in the newspapers like a baseball score, the swaggering leader of a squadron the whole country had fallen in love with. Pilots like that were not supposed to just vanish, and yet that is exactly what happened. In the chaos of the fight over Rabaul, a place so heavily defended that flying over it at all was close to suicidal, Boyington's Corsair was hit, and it fell away toward the sea far below, and the sky closed up behind it. The other Black Sheep, low on fuel and still fighting for their own lives, could do nothing but turn for home and hope. Back at their base, the men of the Black Sheep Squadron waited for Pappy to come home the way he always had. He did not come. Search planes went out over the water off Rabaul, combing the sea for any sign of their commander, a raft, a parachute, a man in the waves. They found nothing. Day after day the searches came back empty, and slowly, terribly, the squadron and then the Marine Corps came to the only conclusion the evidence allowed. Major Gregory Boyington, the greatest ace the Marines had gone down over Rabaul and had not survived. He was officially listed as missing in action, which, over that stretch of enemy water, everyone understood to mean dead. The most famous Marine pilot of the war had flown his last mission, and the legend, it seemed, was over. But Gregory Boyington was not dead, and what had actually happened to him in the sea off Rabaul was stranger than anyone searching for him could have guessed. He had gotten out of his falling Corsair, wounded, alive, and utterly alone, and had come down into the open ocean, far from any friendly ship or shore, deep in enemy waters. By every reasonable expectation, a man in that situation was as good as gone. He would drown or die of his wounds, or simply drift away and vanish. Instead, out of that same enemy sea, something surfaced beside him, and it was not an American rescue. Pappy Boyington was about to be pulled out of the water by the very people he had spent the war fighting. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end. What surfaced next to Pappy Boyington in the sea off Rabaul was a Japanese submarine. Its crew pulled the wounded American pilot out of the water and took him aboard, and in that moment the story flipped completely. The man America was about to mourn as dead was, in fact, very much alive, and now in the hands of the enemy. Think about the strange collision of it from the Japanese side. They had fished a lone, half-drowned airman out of the ocean, and only gradually would they come to understand exactly who they had caught. Not just any downed pilot, but the famous Marine ace, the commander of the Black Sheep, the man whose face had been in American magazines. The enemy had captured one of the most valuable prisoners in the Pacific, and they had no intention of letting the world know. There is a bitter irony buried in that rescue. The Japanese submarine crew, by pulling Boyington from the sea, had saved his life. He would almost certainly have died out there otherwise. But they had saved it into captivity, and Japanese captivity in the Second World War was its own kind of ordeal. Boyington was taken first to Rabaul, that same stronghold he had been bombing and strafing for months, now as a prisoner inside it. From there, the Japanese moved him deeper into their empire, through their island bases and eventually all the way to the home islands of Japan itself, into the network of prison camps where captured Allied airmen and sailors were held. And crucially, the Japanese did something that would shape the next 20 months of Boyington's life, and the grief of everyone who knew him. They never officially registered him as a prisoner of war. During the war, there was a system, imperfect but real, by which nations at war informed each other, usually through the Red Cross, which enemy soldiers they were holding prisoner, so that families could at least know their sons were alive. The Japanese frequently did not follow it, and in Boyington's case, they did not follow it at all. They simply held him, quietly, off the books, a captured ace who to the outside world had ceased to exist. No notification went to the Americans. No word reached his squadron or his family. As far as the United States was concerned, Pappy Boyington had gone into the sea off Rabaul and never come out. He had become, in the fullest sense of the word, a ghost, a living man erased from the record, held by an enemy who would not admit he was there. So begin two completely separate stories, running at the same time, that would not meet again for a year and a half. In one of them, back in the United States, Gregory Boyington was a fallen hero, mourned and about to be immortalized. In the other, on the far side of the Pacific, he was a starving prisoner fighting simply to stay alive, with no way of knowing whether anyone on Earth even knew he was still breathing. To understand the full weight of what he endured, we have to follow him into the camps, and then see what his own country was doing in his name while he was there. If the men behind the famous names are why you're here, what happened to them after the newspapers stopped reporting? Subscribe, because that is exactly what this channel exists to remember. Because for 20 months, Pappy Boyington disappeared into the Japanese prison camp system, and it was a brutal place to survive. He was moved between camps, ending up at last near Tokyo, in the same network that held other captured Allied fighting men. Prisoners in Japanese hands endured near-starvation rations, harsh treatment, isolation and forced labor, and Boyington endured all of it. The famous ace, the swaggering squadron commander, reduced to just another hungry prisoner counting the days in a foreign cell. By the accounts that come down to us, like most who survived that captivity, he was worn down to near-skeletal thinness by the end. The man who had been larger than life was fighting a smaller, grimmer, quieter war now, the war simply to last. He was not entirely alone in it, and that matters. In the camps, Boyington found himself among other captured Americans, men whose names would also become famous. Held in the same system was Louis Zamperini, the Olympic runner whose own survival story would one day be told around the world, and Richard O'Kane, who had commanded the most successful American submarine of the war before being sunk and captured. These were men of extraordinary toughness, thrown together at the bottom of the enemy's empire, and they did what prisoners have always done to survive. They endured together, they kept each other's spirits from breaking, and they held on to the stubborn belief that the war would end and they would go home. For Boyington, whose whole identity had been built on being the boldest man in the sky, the challenge now was the opposite of a dogfight. It was the slow, grinding patience of staying alive with no control over anything. And here is the part that gives the story its strange power. While Pappy Boyington was starving in a Japanese camp, unregistered and unknown, his own country was busy turning him into an immortal. Rumors did drift back. Now and then, a few newspaper reports speculating that Boyington might somehow be alive, a prisoner, but there was no confirmation, no official word, nothing solid to hold on to. He was afforded no mail, so he could send no proof of life, and so, in the absence of any evidence that he had survived, the United States government proceeded on the assumption that its greatest Marine ace was dead, and it moved to honor him the way a grateful nation honors its fallen heroes. It decided to award Gregory Boyington the Medal of Honor. The problem, of course, was that the man they were about to memorialize was still alive. It is one of the most remarkable situations of the entire war. A living man, held prisoner and utterly cut off, being awarded his nation's scythe that he had died, the medal itself set aside, waiting until someone could confirm whether he was alive to receive it, or whether it should be handed, folded in a box, to his grieving family. To see how that came about and why it mattered so much, we have to leave the prison camp for a moment and go back to the country that thought it had lost him. In March of 1944, roughly 2 months after Pappy Boyington vanished over Rabaul, the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, signed the citation awarding him the Medal of Honor. The award recognized his extraordinary record as a fighter ace and squadron commander over the preceding months, the long string of victories, the daring, courageous persistence, the leadership that had made the Black Sheep famous. It was, by every measure, deserved. But it was awarded to a man his country believed was gone, and so the Medal of Honor for Gregory Boyington was, in a sense, a memorial, a nation's way of saying that this man's courage would not be forgotten now that he was, as far as anyone knew, dead. The physical medal was held by the Navy Department quietly against the day someone could finally determine Boyington's true fate, whether it would be pinned on a living chest or presented to a family at a graveside that held no body. Picture the grief and the strange, suspended uncertainty of it for the people who knew him, the men of the Black Sheep Squadron, who had followed Pappy into the deadliest skies of the Pacific and idolized him, had to absorb that their commander was gone, and then hear that the nation was giving him its highest honor, which only made the loss feel more final and more official. His family had to live in the worst kind of limbo, the near certainty that he was dead, shadowed by the faint, tormenting rumors that he might somehow be alive in enemy hands, with no way ever to know for sure. For a year and a half, that was the state of things. Pappy Boyington existed, on the American side of the war, only as a memory and a medal in a drawer, a hero frozen in the moment of his disappearance, mourned by everyone who had known the living man. And it might have stayed that way. There is a version of this story, the version that happened to thousands of other missing men, in which Boyington simply never comes back, in which the medal is eventually handed to his family, and the missing in action becomes a permanent unanswered absence, and the ghost stays a ghost forever. Many men who went into Japanese captivity off the books did not survive it, and their fates were never fully known. Boyington himself, in the camp, had no way of knowing which version of the story he was living in. He did not know that he had been given the Medal of Honor. He did not know if his family thought he was alive or dead. He did not know if the war would end before his body gave out. All he could do was endure, one day at a time, and wait for an ending he could not see. And then, in the summer of 1945, the war finally began to end. But before we follow the war to its end and find out how a dead man came back to life, it is worth stopping to ask the question this whole story keeps circling. Who was Pappy Boyington in the first place? How does a man become the kind of legend that a nation mourns with its highest medal, and the kind of man tough enough to survive 20 months in an enemy camp that killed so many others? He was not a typical Marine officer, and the Black Sheep were not a typical squadron. To understand both the legend and the survivor, we have to go back before Rabaul, before the medal, to where the ace came from. Let us widen the lens. Gregory Boyington was born in 1912 in Idaho, and he was, from early on, a man who did not fit neatly into boxes. He graduated from the University of Washington, and in 1936 he became a United States Marine and a pilot, and he was, by all accounts, a gifted flyer and a difficult, hard-living man, the kind who was brilliant in a cockpit and trouble on the ground. He drank hard, he brawled, and he chafed against the peacetime Marine Corps. And so, before America was even in the war, Boyington did something drastic. He resigned from the Marines to go and fight as a hired pilot in China, joining the legendary group of American volunteers flying for the Chinese against Japan. The outfit history remembers as the Flying Tigers. It was there, in the skies over Burma and China, that Boyington first learned the deadly trade of the fighter race. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and America entered the war, Boyington came home and rejoined the Marine Corps he had left. By 1943 he was in the South Pacific, and in September of that year he was handed something that did not look like an opportunity. A scratch collection of replacement pilots, spare men without a settled squadron of their own, and told to make something of them. Boyington was older than most of them. Old enough, at around 30, that in the youthful world of fighter pilots they took to calling him Pappy. The men wanted to name their new squadron something rowdy and disreputable, something that matched their cast-off origins and their commander's reputation, but the name they first chose was too crude for the newspapers to print. So they settled on one that was perfect anyway, the Black Sheep, and under Pappy Boyington, the Black Sheep became one of the most feared and famous fighting squadrons of the entire war. What Boyington did with that scratch squadron flying the bent-wing Vought Corsair was extraordinary. In his first tour with the Black Sheep over the South Pacific, he shot down 14 enemy fighters in just 32 days, a staggering rate of killing that stunned even other pilots, while the squadron as a whole racked up victory after victory against the Japanese. His personal count climbed through the autumn of 1943, past 20 toward the American record, and with every kill his fame grew back home and across the Pacific. He led from the front, flew with a reckless brilliance, and inspired in his men a fierce loyalty. By the end of December 1943, Pappy Boyington was closing in on the highest score any American fighter pilot had ever achieved, which is exactly why that mission over Rabaul on the 3rd of January 1944 mattered so much, and why his disappearance hit the country so hard. So hold the whole shape of him now. A brilliant, restless, hard-living pilot who had already fought the Japanese with the Flying Tigers before America was even in the war, who took a squadron of cast-offs and made them famous, who became the deadliest ace the Marines had, and who then vanished at the very peak of his fame into the sea off Rabaul. Knowing who he was makes both halves of the story land harder. The recklessness and the toughness that made him a great ace were the same qualities that would keep him alive, barely, through 20 months of captivity that broke other men. The legend and the survivor were the same person, and that survivor was still alive, in a camp near Tokyo, in the summer of 1945, when the war he had helped to fight finally came crashing to its end. In August of 1945, the war in the Pacific ended, and the great question of the prison camps suddenly became urgent. Who, exactly, was still alive inside them? American aircraft began flying over the known and suspected camps across Japan, dropping food and supplies to the starving prisoners who had survived. Men the Allies were only now able to reach, and on one of those supply flights, as an American plane came in low over a prison camp, someone aboard looked down and saw something painted, in huge letters, across the roof of one of the barracks, a message the prisoners inside had put there for exactly this moment. It read, "PAPPY BOYINGTON HERE." In that instant, a year and a half of grief was overturned. The ghost was not a ghost. The dead ace was alive. Pappy Boyington had survived. The news that Pappy Boyington was alive swept back to the Black Sheep Squadron and across the country like a miracle. To the men who had flown with him and mourned him, it was as if their commander had come back from the grave. Boyington, emaciated from his long captivity but alive, was freed from the camp and made his way home, and when he reached the United States in September of 1945, the surviving Black Sheep were there to meet him, and they threw the kind of enormous, joyous celebration that only a resurrection can inspire. The magazines that had reported his death now reported his return. The man who had been awarded the Medal of Honor as a dead hero was standing in front of them, thin and battered but grinning, entirely alive. It was one of the happiest reversals of the entire war. And now, at last, the Medal of Honor that had been waiting in a drawer for a year and a half could be given the way it was meant to be given, to a living man. In early October of 1945, Gregory Boyington was brought to Washington. First, the Commandant of the Marine Corps presented him with the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor, and then, the very next day, at a ceremony at the White House, the President of the United States, Harry Truman, personally placed the Medal of Honor around the neck of the ace his country had spent a year and a half believing was dead. Think of the sheer improbability of that moment. A medal signed by one President Roosevelt for a man presumed killed, finally pinned on that same man's living chest by the next president, Truman, after 20 months in an enemy camp that was never supposed to let him out. Colonel Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, the restless Idaho pilot who fought the Japanese with the Flying Tigers before his country was even in the war, who forged a squadron of cast-offs into the famous Black Sheep, who became the deadliest ace in Marine Corps history, who was shot down over Rabaul at the peak of his fame and pulled from the sea by the enemy, who endured 20 months in a Japanese prison camp as a ghost the world believed was dead, and who then came home alive to receive the Medal of Honor his nation had awarded him as a fallen hero, lived on for more than 40 years after the war ended. He had survived the deadliest skies of the Pacific and the camps that killed so many others. When he finally died, in 1988, he was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery, among the honored dead he had once, for a year and a half, been counted among. There is something in Pappy Boyington's story that goes beyond the kill count and the medal, and it is worth naming. We tend to build our heroes into single, shining moments, the record-setting ace, frozen forever at the peak of his fame. But Boyington's real story is that the peak was not the end. After the glory came the fall into the sea, and after the fall came 20 months of anonymous, unglamorous suffering, the exact opposite of a dogfight. No audience, no headlines, no control, just the daily grind of staying alive when the world had already written you off. The same man was both the dazzling ace and the starving prisoner who would not die. And maybe that second, quieter courage, the endurance of the forgotten man in the cell, was the greater of the two. His country gave him its highest medal for the way he fought. He earned it a second time in a place no one was watching. Most people remember Pappy Boyington, if they remember him at all, as the swaggering ace of the Black Sheep, and far fewer know that he spent 20 months as a ghost in a Japanese camp, or that his country handed out its highest honor believing he was dead. That gap between the famous moment and the forgotten ordeal is exactly why places like this comment section matter. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather flew in the Pacific, or served with the Marines in the Solomons, or was held as a prisoner of war and came home changed and rarely spoke of it, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them, one thing they did or said or that you remember. The men who endured the parts of the war that never made the headlines deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them, and there always will be.